more inclined to cheat and do because they feel that they can get away with it. If Japanese were more individualistic and assertive, then probably the general level of corruption would be less. Hence, as Japanese individualize more due to glow media, the general level of corruption should go down because it will be tolerated less and punished more. There will be more whistleblowers who will not stand for it. Superiority myth. In a culture which is as homogeneous and monocultured as Japan, with almost no minority groups to challenge majority myths, it's easy for Japanese superiority myths to be self-sustaining. Every culture is self-congratulatory. Every culture has people who get emotional with their flag and their national anthem. Look at the Olympic gold medalists on the podium when their anthems are played and their flags are raised. But in Japan's case, these chauvinisms take a more extreme form. There have been many pseudo-scientific books written in Japan about Japanese superiority. Some of them are simply funny to non-Japanese, but in many cases they are written in all seriousness, and many Japanese believe them. With world travel and glow media, the Japanese will be able to go through the same demythification of their chauvinistic values as did the French in the 1990s, or the young Australians did in the 1970s. That is, they can be exposed to the superior realities of non-Japanese cultures elsewhere on the planet. It will be a painful process. It's not easy to be forced to give up one's cherished beliefs in one's culture's superiority. There is a deep need to feel superior to others. It's ego-satisfying. Nearly all human beings feel the need to be a member of a group, since we evolved as deeply social apes. Therefore, it's not surprising that it's a source of satisfaction to feel that the group one belongs to is superior to others. This psychological phenomenon occurs in all nation-states. Why do all countries have national flags and national anthems? So, to be given concrete proof that one's group is not so special, and is in fact relative to most other cultures on the planet one of the worst in certain respects, can be deeply disturbing, demoralizing, even depressing. It's not surprising that attempts by non-Japanese to demythologize the Japanese have been largely unsuccessful, but with the enormous influence of glow media in the future, the Japanese will not be able to resist the onslaught. They will lose their chauvinism, and so will all other cultures on the planet, and that will greatly aid the growth of a sense of a global culture, especially when a truly global language develops and is widely used in communication across the planet. Sadomasochism. Japanese have a reputation for having sadomasochistic personalities. On their television are games of such a type. For example, how long can someone tolerate sitting in a tub of ice water? I had a woman friend in Japan who would pull back my finger towards the wrist to see how much pain I could take. This struck me as sick, and I objected strongly to her and told her never to do that again. We then got into an argument about whether doing such a thing was symptomatic of Japanese sadomasochism, and whether such a national characteristic might help explain why the Japanese were so hated by their Asian neighbours in World War II for Japan's infamous cruelty. I suspect so. Where does this sadomasochism come from, and how to remove it to make Japanese happier? I suspect it's yet another symptom of Japan's lack of individualism. When young Japanese are pressured to conform all their young lives, they develop sadomasochistic personalities. Japanese sadomasochism would account for the high incidence of bullying in the schools. Thus the suggestions given above for ridding Japan of its overcrowding and bullying problems would apply here as well. When Japanese children can grow up with much healthier individuation, they will be less sadomasochistic and happier. H. US. Cons. Arrogant. The Americans are arrogant, that is for sure. They have a worldwide reputation for that. For example, in the Sydney Olympics in 2000, the intercultural insensitivities of the Americans barracking USA, USA made them extremely unpopular, to the point that later in the Olympics, when an American competitor screwed up or lost, the non-Americans in the stands actually cheered, or rather jeered. As mentioned earlier, the US is today unquestionably the planet's dominant culture. It is number one in so many things that it's quite natural for Americans, especially less educated ones, to feel and express their sense of superiority when they are overseas. Thus, to some extent, the world will simply have to put up with American arrogance because it is valid, it is warranted. The Americans simply are superior. I've lived 5 years in the US, which was my 6th country, so it was easy for me to feel its many superiorities by simply comparing the way Americans did things with how things were done in the previous 5 countries I had lived in. But cultures rise and fall, as history shows us. Personally, I feel that the US is already on the way down, but that most Americans don't know it yet. Going down is a relative concept. In reality, life quality is actually improving for most Americans as time goes on, as economic standards of living improve, education gets better, etc. But things are improving a lot faster in more dynamic cultures, in much bigger cultures. Here I'm thinking about the culture I'm currently living in, that is China. I don't see the US remaining top dog this century. I see China or India or Europe taking the top spot this century until, I hope, there are no more countries, only globa. Ad-libbing now, I think at least amongst the educated classes in America, they realize America's going down. You only have to walk around the malls in America and see about a third of the stores in the malls have been closed down. America's in a depression. The real unemployment rate in America is pretty well as bad as it was in the Great Depression of the 30s, about 25%. Back to the book. Nevertheless, even though a particular country may be considered to be top dog in general, no country is top in everything across the board. The US certainly has its faults and inferiorities. In fact, it's seriously starting to fall behind other cultures, especially Europe, at such a rate that the Europeans are increasingly sneering at Americans, particularly considering American insularity and arrogance. Europeans are now criticizing the Americans for the same kinds of reasons the Americans used to criticize the French in the 1950s, with such sentiments as the arrogant inferiority of the French. Europeans are overtaking the Americans in many fields now, but most Americans are unaware of this fact and maintain their traditional superior attitudes towards Europeans that are no longer justified in fact. The Europeans are more cosmopolitan, more multicultured than the Americans, and often know more about America than the Americans know about Europe. So what is happening is that increasingly Europeans are feeling superior towards Americans based on modern realities, yet are faced with traditional American feelings of superiority towards Europeans that are based on outdated realities. But the Americans, being extremely insular, monocultured, and definitely monolingual, are simply unaware that their attitudes are increasingly becoming outdated. There is thus no meeting of minds. The two sets of superiority attitudes simply go past each other. How can Americans lose their arrogance, at least to the extent that they become better informed as to their relative inferiorities? Again, Glow Media will play a pivotal role. Americans do travel internationally, but usually only the better educated, more intellectual Americans. Most Americans are content to explore their own vast continent-sized country and not have to bother with foreign languages and bloody foreigners. Americans have the disadvantage of having created the world language and hence can afford to be linguistically lazy. Americans and the Brits have a bad international reputation for being foreign language incompetent and lazy. Americans' monolingualism makes them more mono, less multi, less cosmopolitan, and less sophisticated in the eyes of multis. Nevertheless, it'll be the Americans, very probably, who will continue developing the Brad law phenomenon, that is, the bit rate annual doubling of the internet speed. Thus it will be largely the Americans who will, indirectly, globalize the world. It will be the Americans who, in the coming 30 years, from the time of writing, will pioneer the technologies that will create Glow Media. When the Americans apply Glow Media to themselves, they'll be in for a rude awakening as they learn of their many inferiorities, as discussed in Chapter 2, and further elaborated on in this chapter. It will be a shock for Americans because today they live largely in a state of national self-congratulatory delusion. Americans are not a sophisticated people by world standards, as discussed in Chapter 2. Once the Glow Media images come into the living rooms of hundreds of millions of Americans from all over the world, they will come to learn that they are not so special in many respects, as will also the rest of the world's countries as they learn about themselves. Americans will be humbled and become conscious of their many failings and be motivated to catch up with the world's leaders in those areas where the US is behind, and in some cases way behind. For example, no national health service, the death penalty, shitty television, religious superstitions, etc. Americans are genetically energetic, individualistic people. They selected themselves in choosing to become migrants in the first place. They were typically European working class or lower middle class people who felt that they could get a better life with more opportunities in the new world than the old. Thus, the source of America's migrants was mostly from Europe's lower half, and that basic reality has coloured American culture ever since. The US is not a sophisticated culture, as is all too painfully obvious to the French, for example, who are the most sophisticated people in Europe, and probably the world. The French sneer at Americans for good reasons, but of course monocultured Americans will not understand why the French sneer at them. The American monos have not had the experience of living in the more sophisticated culture of France, so do not understand why the French turn up their noses at American lower-class vulgarity, the American middle-class mindlessness. Perhaps once America's genetic intellectuals, that is, those Americans born with elite intelligence levels, for example the top 1%, are exposed to the way French culture caters to French intellectuals and fosters them in a way that America's middle-class culture does not foster American intellectuals. For example, France has the elite newspaper Le Monde, The World, and France Culture, radio for French intellectuals. They may relish being cared for the first time in their lives and become avid Francophiles. French culture may give them something that American culture does not, that is, support and recognition. French culture would value their intellectual values. America's middle-class culture, with its awful ad-infested television, its dumbed-down news services, its crass pop music, its school bands rather than school orchestras, etc., simply alienate America's intellectuals, so they drop out of mass American society. For them to feel nurtured by a culture, as French culture does to its intellectuals, who are treated as les dieux, les intellectuels, the gods, the intellectuals, may be an intoxicating experience for them. I know I felt this way once I became fluent enough in French to really begin to absorb French values into my personality. I benefited enormously from feeling nurtured and valued by a whole culture so different from the first culture I grew up in, that is Australia, which basically despised its intellectuals, who were thought to be elitist, a dirty word in migrant cultures, but not in France. Fat. Americans are fat and continue to get fatter. This is not just an American problem. It is in fact a consequence of general affluence. The citizens of many rich Western countries are getting fat, and for similar reasons, namely everyone has cars. They sit for hours with the laptop and the internet, as admittedly I do myself. They don't walk, they eat too much cheap junk food, and have unhealthy diets due to ignorance of what is good food to eat. In the case of the US, the statistics on obesity are appalling. 2/3 of the US population is at least overweight, and of these, half are considered obese. I saw this myself in my 5 years in the US. As a male, I found only about 1/10 of American women were slim and curvy enough by my sexual taste to be considered worthy of a second glance. I find Chinese women far more attractive that way, perhaps about 60%. There is growing awareness in the US that the obesity epidemic has become the nation's #1 health problem, and that is getting worse year by year. Because the US has been the first large nation in the world to be confronted with its obesity epidemic due to its reaching a state of mass material affluence before most other countries, the US will have to pioneer measures to tackle the problem. This is starting, but there are measures that Americans can learn from other cultures. An early form of glow media should exist within 10 years of the time of writing, so that Americans can watch what and how other cultures eat who are not fat. They will be able to learn of superior diets from other cultures and become critical of the traditional fatty diets of their own culture. The glow media should help a lot in raising Americans' consciousness concerning healthy eating. I think I'll stop here. I'm running out of memory. So next video I will continue on with the cons of America and how it can learn, and the topic will be religious. Ciao.